enveloped yearly funding and implementation support from the ministry. If you want to refer to that, those are recommendations 68, 80, and 83. And adequate professional development and support to make sure there are knowledgeable and skilled educators who can deliver these interventions. Those are recommendations 83 and 85. The goal is to make evidence-based reading interventions available to all students who require them. The OHRC is also recommending that Ontario school boards adopt a framework involving multi-tiered system of supports, or MTSS, which is also called Response to Intervention, or RTI. Dr. Kim St. Martin will address evidence-based intervention within a multi-tiered system of supports. Dr. St. Martin is Associate Director of Michigan's MTSS Technical Assistance Center. The Technical Assistance Center helps school districts implement and sustain a multi-tiered system of supports in their schools to improve student outcomes in behavior and learning. Welcome, Dr. St. Martin.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to share my screen now, if that's okay.
Wonderful, thanks.
Awesome. Well, it is just such a gift to be with everyone today. So I am here to talk about intensifying literacy instruction. And let me get this going. So I'm here to talk about intensifying literacy instruction and what are the essential practices in order to be able to intensify instruction with really good effect, with robust outcomes. I want to acknowledge my colleagues who are not with me today, but Dr. Sharon Vaughn, Dr. Gary Troya, Dr. Hank Feen, and Dr. Michael Coyne, who helped me in being able to conceptualize the document Intensifying Literacy Instruction, Essential Practices. And I included the link with this PowerPoint if you want to download the document. And it's also available on our my Michigan MTSS Technical Assistance Center's website. So let me set the stage for our time together. So the contents that are in this intensifying guide, they really serve as the foundation for being able to establish policy, being able to allocate resources, and think about providing professional learning to educators and leaders in order to support a range of learners that have literacy difficulties. This is including, but certainly not limited to, students with disabilities. So within a multi-tiered system of support framework, the information that's in this intensifying guide would be categorized as tiers 2 and 3, or I would like to refer to that as the advanced tiers of an MTSS framework. It's important to remember, though, that most of the learners who receive tier 2 and tier 3 supports, they spend majority of their time in the classroom setting. Or for my secondary colleagues who are out there, in the core subject area settings, or tier 1. So the contents that are in the Intensifying Literacy Instruction Essential Practices Guide, it is relevant across all 3 tiers, tiers 1, 2, and 3. We also must not forget the importance of high quality tier 1 class-wide instruction and the curriculum resources and programs that are used by educators to deliver that instruction. And a really effective MTSS framework should meaningfully distinguish the level of intensity between tier 2 intervention supports and tier 3 supports. We must make decisions about students' response to the intervention instruction in order to ensure that we are accelerating outcomes and we're closing that opportunity gap. So here are the 5 essential practices. And they are intentionally ordered, but we are going to really delve into each of these. And granted, we have a short time together, so it's going to be the almost like speed dating approach to introducing information around the intensifying guide. So I'm going to focus on the first one. And the first essential practice is really focusing on a learning progression. It's essential that educators understand a learning progression for how to develop skilled readers and skilled writers. Oftentimes, though, in schools, people use the term literacy. So the term literacy is very commonly used. However, it's important for people to know that reading and writing are their own distinct yet interconnected set of skills. So reading and writing are their own unique set of skill clusters. Each is recognized as important, it's valuable, and it is critical that we do, in fact, help our educators be able to understand how our students actually acquire the reading skills needed and the writing skills needed to be effective readers and writers. Being able to develop instruction and intervention that's going to integrate reading and writing should, in fact, be the goal. Here are some caveats, though. Those 5 essential practices that I just showed 2 slides ago, they have been intentionally ordered. We begin by focusing attention on the skills needed to become a skillful reader and writer. And the remaining practices that are in this guide, they build upon the first. So essential practice 1 is like the foundation to being able to understand how you're going to intensify literacy instruction. If we don't have that solid foundation, any efforts to intensify, it's almost like shadow boxing. Because if our educators aren't equipped with the knowledge to understand how, for example, a first grader coming into first grade needs to, what skills he or she should have understood in kindergarten and what needs to be built upon through first grade into second grade and beyond. If there isn't that solid understanding, then looking at data to see if the learner is or is not responding as we would expected, you're not really going to know what to do. It's going to feel like shadow boxing. So the remaining practices do, in fact, build upon the first. Essential practice 5 does focus on the infrastructures. And so even though that we put the systems or the infrastructures at the end, we don't want people to think that they aren't important. It really is the bookend, because educators and leaders, in order to support people in using these essential practices well, they have to have a supportive infrastructure to do so. And so I love this quote. It's from the book Results Now by Mike Schmoker. Place a good person in a bad system, and the system wins every time. And I think that is so true. That I have seen in my career so many educators who were amazing, came out of school excited, ready to change the lives of the learners in their classrooms, and sadly were put in systems in schools that didn't have structures to support them. So if you place a good person in a bad system, the system will win every time. MTSS, however, is the system. It's the framework. It's the thing that's going to be able to nest the evidence-based practices, the programs that educators are using, the assessments, the procedures to support their use. It is the infrastructure. At the same time, many people don't consider systems very glamorous. However, in their absence, implementation and the outcomes that we would expect to see are going to suffer. 2 more caveats. The primary individuals who are responsible for enacting upon the contents in each essential practice is either going to be leaders at the district, leaders at the school level, or teachers, our general educators, our special education teachers, and individuals who are providing intervention instruction. So to increase the clarity for people who access the Essential Practices Guide, after the essential practice is introduced, there's a brief statement that follows that essential practice, and it indicates who the primary audience should be. Who are the people that are primarily responsible for enacting the contents, the information that's within each of the essential practices. So let's dig into Essential Practices 1. So the very first practice, knowledge and use of a learning progression for developing skilled readers and writers. And I wanted to frame this section around a model. And I want us to have this model in our head. So this model for me, it came to me as a teacher, as an educator, and it has helped me to make decisions about what is important based on the progression of the age of the student. Even though I am an assistant director for an MTSS Technical Assistance Center, I do still tutor students. I still do like to stay fresh in my use of instructional strategies. So this model, known as a simple view of reading, has stayed with me and has really helped me to identify what is important in being able to develop skilled readers. But here is what is important about this, about the simple view of reading. It is simple, but not simplistic. It's structure. It's simple because its structure is recognizable to educators and easily applicable. I recently, had the gift of presenting with Dr. Sharon Vaughn, and we were talking about a literature review that she recently conducted. And if you were to do a search on the simple view of reading, this model right here, it's cited over 1,000 times. Theoretically, it has been tested by more than 20 independent research teams across the world in different languages with the same result. So what's that result and why is it important? That result is that if we think about word recognition, word reading, being able to decode as an important construct, and we think about linguistic comprehension or language comprehension, and that is extracting and constructing meaning from the spoken word. So if we think about those two large constructs, we've got word reading. They know how to read the words. Okay, so that's the first construct. Number two is that they know what those words mean, and they can think about those words within the syntax of the language in which they're using to read. Multiplicatively, not additively, multiplicatively, it equals reading comprehension. And the wonderful thing is that this model, the simple view of reading, it's actually been tested and it continues to hold up in the research. Bottom line is, if students can read words and they know what these words mean and they have an understanding of language, they are in fact going to be able to understand text. So this model, although it's called the simple view of reading, it's not simplistic, but it has absolutely, as an educator, held true to me and has supported me in the work that I continue to do with children. One of the a cognitive scientist, researcher, Mark Seidenberg, I had borrowed this slide from Mark because Mark Seidenberg said, if we think about the simple view of reading in the context of beginning readers, we have to think about what they have when they enter into school. Learners have knowledge of spoken language. They come to school with words in their mental lexicon. They come to school with an understanding of how to orally construct sentences or grammar, and they have knowledge of the world as they've seen it through their eyes. So this is what learners have when they enter into school. They must learn, though, how print represents sounds. And this has to happen in order to be able to read. So what we've done in the Intensifying Literacy Instruction Essential Practices Guide is we've really tried to take the simple view of reading that you've seen 2 slides ago, and we've tried to outline the specific decoding and word recognition skills and language comprehension skills and reading comprehension processes that should in fact appear within instruction from pre-kindergarten through 12th grade. And you'll notice that what I have done here is if you were to access this document right now, you will not see this beautiful graphic. The second edition is currently in press, and we got pretty, we got a graphic designer to really think about how to represent the fact that each of these gray bars that you see under word recognition, that you see under language comprehension and reading comprehension, each of those gray bars is very important because what it represents is a specific skill or process that is within each of those constructs in that multiplicative formula of the simple view of reading. And the bar tells you where formal instruction begins, where formal instruction in an estimate typically ends. And then some of these bars, like basic phonics, multisyllabic decoding, have at the very end a little line that continues to expand. And what that line means in the case of basic phonics and decoding is that there's going to be ongoing use of phonics and word recognition skills. And I'm going to, as a student, even as an adult, I'm going to give you an example in a minute. I continue to refine my multi-syllabic decoding skills, and I transfer it into new context. If any of you have children in the audience, I have 3 boys, 16, 15, and 9. But when my children were younger, they loved dinosaurs. And so I would have to read the dinosaur encyclopedia every night before Logan went to bed. And if you've ever read a dinosaur encyclopedia, your multi-syllabic decoding skills are absolutely put into action. And so that is the perfect example of, even as an adult, where I continue to use my decoding word recognition skills, but I'm applying them into new context. You see other things that, for example, are in language comprehension and reading comprehension, like oral language, higher order cognitive skills. Those are things that are going to continue throughout a learner's educational career. It's just that we're going to continue to refine these skills. They're going to transfer to new contexts, new courses and subject areas. They get into middle school, as they get into high school. So the instruction in language comprehension and reading comprehension doesn't really ever stop. It just continues to be refined and transferred into new ways. The intentional braiding, though, of each of these bars is really important, because our colleague Hollis Scarborough, who is so famous for the reading rope, has said that skilled reading is really the braiding of each of the strands that are in the rope. And if any of these strands were to become frayed, it weakens the rope that was braided together. It weakens the rope. And so this is a nice visual to be able to think about what skills are critical to advance word recognition, to advance language comprehension, to advance students' comprehension of written text or reading comprehension. And we have to be very intentional in our instruction to be able to do that. So this is the foundation. Having our educators understand how a learner develops from a novice reader to fluent reading to skilled reading doesn't happen overnight, and it really takes intentional teaching of many of these specific strands or skills in the reading learning progression. You will see the essential practice guide also has the writing learning progression. Now, some of you are like, ooh, that does not look like the pretty braid that we just saw in the previous slide. That is because the graphic designer is not done with it. So, but you are absolutely right. When we think about a writing learning progression, we frame those particular skills around the simple view of writing, where there are transcription skills multiplied by translation skills, and that equals skilled written expression. So some of those transcription skills are handwriting, spelling, conventions, keyboarding. Some of those translation skills are grammar, the parts of speech, subject and predicate agreement, morphology, thinking about sentence structure and syntax, the writing process, learners' ability to plan, write, draft, revise, publish, and text structure, narratives versus explanatory pieces versus persuasive pieces, biographies, folktales. And so these things as well have to be very much braided together, woven together in order to develop skilled written expression. And one of the caveats, right when I started today, was that reading and writing do go hand in hand. And the ability to support our educators to meaningfully integrate both into instruction is, in fact, the goal. So here are the big takeaways with the learning progression. If we're going to develop skillful readers and writers, it is going to require instruction in very specific skills. Those things have to be carefully sequenced. They have to be built upon throughout our learners' educational careers. And the things that need to be taught can be presented in a very simple way, in a very simple framework, like the simple view of reading, the simple view of writing. Remember, not simplistic. However, it's simple in that educators recognize it. It's easy to recognize. It's easy to start to wrap your mind around its contents. And if, in the third takeaway, if educators are uncertain about how learning to read and learning to write develop, then how best to teach what needs to be taught and to provide intervention instruction to accelerate outcomes is going to be limited. So these are kind of our big takeaways related to the learning progression. So that's essential practice 1. And when we move into essential practice 2, building upon the first essential practice 2 is designing and using an evidence-based intervention platform. And that intervention platform is the foundation for effective intervention instruction. So let me define what we mean by an intervention platform. So an intervention platform, as we've defined it on page 13 of the Intensifying Guide, it is a collection of practices and programs. These things have been very carefully and intentionally evaluated, reviewed, selected. They are used as the foundation or the building blocks by which we can customize intervention based on data, based on students' response to the intervention instruction. When we think about an intervention platform, myself and the authors who are on the Intensifying Literacy Instruction Guide really do believe that the resources that are listed in a school's intervention platform are not intended to be developed by individual teachers. What we say is that designing effective reading and writing intervention materials requires significant expertise in the content area, in instructional design principles and learning science. And frankly, it requires a lot of time that our teachers just do not have. So we don't expect teachers to go home and have to develop intervention materials that they're going to use with learners. We very much do want to, where and when appropriate, be able to prioritize intervention curriculum resources, things that have been published, have been studied, and have been intentionally reviewed because of their evidence, because they can be implemented and supported in order to be the foundation of intervention instruction. There are a couple of things that you guys could use to help guide what we mean by quality intervention curriculum resources. And the way that I'm going to frame this part is based on some resources from our colleagues at the National Center on Intensive Intervention, or NCII. The National Center on Intensive Intervention is a federally funded, by the U.S. Department of Education, a federally funded technical assistance center that focuses on intensification. So really, truly, students with the most significant and persistent needs, and how we would support educators and leaders to be able to accelerate their outcomes. That is the purpose of the National Center for Intensive Intervention. So one of the resources that NCII has introduced is something referred to as the taxonomy of intervention intensity. And I'm going to explain this and explain how it connects to helping to inform what schools select to be able to provide intervention. So the purpose of the taxonomy of intervention intensity, it's to support educators in doing two things. First, in evaluating intervention curriculum resources, and two, in being able to build or create intervention intensity. So to think about, based on students' data, if students are not responding as we would have expected, you could use the taxonomy of intervention intensity, and you can look at specific things to adapt the instruction in order to intensify. And so the interventions, if you're going to use the taxonomy of intervention intensity to evaluate and review intervention curriculum resources, then there are additional resources to help guide you. And I'm going to share that in just a moment. However, the review comes by looking at the dimensions that are listed in the left-hand column with that little asterisk after it. You're looking at the strength or the evidence of the intervention curriculum resources, dosage, alignment, something called attention to transfer, which I'm going to define in a moment, comprehensiveness. Are there behavioral supports in the intervention? And can it be individualized to be able to address learner needs? These same dimensions that we just read in that column are also used to build the intervention intensity. So you would take the carefully selected intervention curriculum resources, you would choose one or two of these dimensions to adapt the instruction, like behavioral supports and comprehensiveness. And I'm going to share a couple of examples of these things. At the bottom of this PowerPoint slide, I gave you the link so you could access the PDF of this document. On this side of the document that you're seeing on the screen, this is applying the taxonomy of intervention intensity to academics. If you were to flip it over, you would see it applied from a behavioral support lens. So these are the dimensions of intervention intensity. We look at strength, dosage, alignment, attention to transfer, comprehensiveness, behavioral support, and individualization. So if we were thinking about how to review and evaluate interventions, some things that we would want to ask ourselves. And before I list those things, I want to be mindful of defining the we. So I'm a big believer that you have to have individuals with expertise in understanding reading science, the science of reading, understanding structured language and literacy. You should have people that understand the learning progression for developing skilled readers and writers. But you also need leaders who are responsible and have the decision-making authority to allocate resources, to be able to purchase the resources that educators need to actually have the interventions in their hands, all the components of the interventions. So these people together are asking questions like, does the evidence suggest that the intervention is expected to lead to improved outcomes? And that's getting at the strength of the evidence. Something like, will the group size, the duration of the intervention, or the duration of the intervention curriculum in and of itself, the frequency at which it should be delivered, does that provide sufficient opportunities for the learner to be able to respond to the instruction? Meaning that as an educator, I want to make the learner's thinking visible to me. And the only way that I can make what's going on in the minds of our students visible is if they are saying something, they are doing something, they are writing something. So when you see an opportunity to respond, what I mean by that is they are saying something, doing something, or writing something to give me some indication as an educator as to how well my teaching's going. Am I actually moving the needle in being able to help the learner understand the skills? So you want to think about that. You got to think about dosage. You got to think about those things. You also want to consider alignment. Does the intervention match to the student's identified needs? So is there a way by which you could select intervention curriculum resources that, for example, have a way to place students into the intervention, like a placement test? There are some interventions that I use that do a nice job of that based on the student's result in the placement test, they could start, for example, in lesson 13, as opposed to having to begin right at the very first lesson. Or it tells you, no, they're not going to place into this intervention. It's either too easy or it's too difficult. So we want to think about alignment. We also want to think about attention to transfer, or the learner's ability. Does the program or the curriculum resource support students generalizing what they've learned to other contexts? So the question that the people who are reviewing and evaluating interventions would ask is, does it help students generalize the learned skills to general education settings or to other types of tasks? The team also needs to think about comprehensiveness, or these elements of explicit instruction. So does the intervention include elements of explicit instruction? Does it include things like modeling, guided practice? Does it, I believe many of us on this call have probably heard Dr. Anita Archer present. So when I think of explicitness or comprehensiveness, I'm thinking of these really key elements of explicit instruction. We also want the team reviewing the interventions to consider things like behavioral supports and academic supports. So in the case of, if we were looking at reading interventions, I would want to look at the extent to which students would have opportunities to develop the behaviors to be successful during the intervention instruction. And not all interventions are actually written with built-in behavioral supports. Nonetheless, though, it's a good question to ask as you're thinking about reviewing and selecting intervention curriculum resources. And last but not least, the individuals who are reviewing these curriculum resources to be a part of the intervention platform should think about things like, can the intervention be individualized based on data, with a database protocol in order to be able to meet their needs? So these are the key considerations for starting to think about how to carefully review, select things that would go on in a school's intervention platform. Our colleagues at the National Center on Intensive Intervention have created a rubric to help guide that process. And I will say, I'm going to totally reveal the dork that I am. I love doing these. I actually have led a couple of sessions with people who said, I want to get some practice using this academic rating rubric. And so we've taken various intervention curriculum like phonics for reading and others, and we've sat down with this rubric and we've walked through together how one would actually use this rubric to help guide in a careful evaluation around each of the dimensions that we were just talking about. And you have the link to this on the bottom of the slide as well. So that's essential practice 2. It's very much focusing on the intervention platform. And it builds upon the essential practice 1, knowledge needed for developing skilled readers and writers, and selecting interventions to have as a platform or the foundation for delivering intervention instruction. And then that leads us into essential practice 3. Practice 3 is you've got learners and intervention, but now we have to think about ongoing database decision-making for providing and intensifying the interventions. So we've got to think about assessment and data use here. So in practice 3, what we really are talking about is using student data in an ongoing way to help our educators make the best decisions possible in order to inform the decisions that they make around how to deliver, how to adapt the intervention supports. There are 4 types of data that are listed in Essential Practice 3. And screening is one of them. Progress monitoring is the other. And diagnostic. And you're saying, well, wait a minute, you just gave me 3. That's because we split progress monitoring into 2 categories. So when we talk about progress monitoring data, we talk about 2 types. We talk about progress monitoring assessments that are considered general outcome progress monitoring assessments. So I'm not sure if some of you use a curriculum-based measure like Acadience or Dibbles or FastBridge. But these are typically standardized. They have standard administration and scoring protocols. They are sensitive to being able to detect student improvements. They measure end of year outcomes. So we're really looking at wanting to see where, for example, first graders are, and we want to measure how close they are getting to the end of first grade outcomes. Content mastery progress monitoring assessments, those are different. they provide information about the extent to which students understood the specific skills that were the focus of the intervention instruction. And so, for example, in another intervention that I actually use for adolescent learners in grades 4 and 5, I use a program called Rewards, which is a multi-syllabic intervention curriculum resource. And every 5 lessons, there's a checkup. And that checkup is a content mastery progress monitoring assessment that pulls from the 5 lessons of that week. It pulls critical skills that the learners were taught, that I hope have been adequately taught. And I want to now see the extent to which they understand those, they actually understood those skills. So not all intervention programs have content mastery progress monitoring assessments. However, let's not get caught up on that. The overarching purpose of a content mastery progress monitoring assessment is to tell me as an educator how well my instruction resulted in the learners in my intervention group, how well they understood the concepts and skills that were the focus of instruction. Diagnostic data is the 4th type of assessment. And I want to just give a nod to diagnostic assessment data, because I do think that too often I see people jump to diagnostic assessment data for more kids than is needed. So I just want to give a nod to the fact that diagnostic assessments are really administered when you need additional information in order to better define the learner's strengths, the learner's needs. I have seen people be able to use progress monitoring data, really analyze the pattern of students' responses, look at the errors that were made, and be able to use progress monitoring data in a diagnostic way. However, there are times when you do need more information. So progress monitoring data, whether it's general outcome progress monitoring data or content mastery progress monitoring data, that wasn't sufficient enough to really inform people, a team of individuals, to say, how best do we intensify the instruction for this learner? It's not required for all students. It really is required for select students. I am an educator first. I go all the way back to my roots as a teacher. And I really want more time spent on teaching. I don't want more time spent on assessment, unless the assessments are going to guide my instruction. And I can do that in efficient and effective ways. I don't need a diagnostic assessment that could take 45 to 50 minutes per learner to that then sucks up a lot of time. It takes time away from instruction. So there are different types of diagnostic assessments. There's informal, easy to administer and interpret, and then there's some very standardized diagnostic assessments that are used, especially used by some of my colleagues who are school psychologists that are doing a much more in-depth evaluation to look at the learner's strengths, the learner's needs, in order to inform the provision of perhaps special education services, as an example. Some examples of informal diagnostic assessments: phonics inventory, a basic or advanced spelling screener. I gave you the name of the document because some people say, well, wait a minute, it's got the word screener in it. So by definition, isn't that a screening assessment? Not necessarily. When we think about the different types of assessments, there are characteristics of screening assessments that have to do with efficient, effective to administer, reliable, valid. Just because something is titled that, it has screener at the end of it, doesn't mean it's a screening assessment. But this is one that is popular in some of the spaces in which I work, and it would be categorized as a diagnostic assessment, even though its name is basic or advanced spelling screener. So just some additional examples of standardized diagnostic assessments: the qualitative reading inventory, the comprehensive test of phonological processing, or the CTOP. Those are examples of those standardized diagnostic assessments. So that's essential practice 3, and it really builds us then into essential practice 4. And this is the part right now where I'm living and breathing in the spaces in which I work in the state of Michigan. So Essential Practice 4 is talking about adaptations to increase the instructional intensity of the intervention. This really is moving into tier 3. I don't know if you remember, but one of the very first slides I shared was talking about, it was kind of setting the stage, and it was talking about the need to have, if you're going to implement MTSS, then there really should be definition around the distinct level of intensity between tier 2 and tier 3. Sadly, I've seen a lot of people whose tier 2 supports and tier 3 supports look almost identical, with the only difference being that maybe in tier 3 there's some kids that have more smaller group instruction or one-on-one time, but there's a lot more that goes into quality intensification in order to accelerate outcomes. So practice 4 really delves into that. So let's take a peek. So when we are talking about individual students that have not been as responsive to tier 2 intervention instruction like we had hoped, then for those individual learners, we would want to begin to develop with a team an individualized intensive intervention plan. This is not an individualized education plan, or an IEP, as we call it in the United States. This does not take the place of a legal document like an IEP is for students with disabilities. They have a specific learning disability. This would be in addition to. It is meant to be able to enhance the instruction that the special education teacher is providing. And again, it's going to get us to hone in on very specific dimensions of intervention intensity that, based on data, we're going to hypothesize need to be changed, need to be adapted in order to intensify. I will tell you, though, that you're looking at an example individualized plan. Given the pandemic, and given the fact that we have had learners that have not had access to instruction, in some cases for quite some time, I am seeing situations in the spaces in which I'm working where we have to do group intensification. And that is because if we didn't do group intensification, we'd have to write individualized plans for 20 plus kids in a grade level. And so we are, because of the pandemic, we're looking for ways to try to support the efficiency at which we're teaching interventionists and others who are on this team, which we refer to as a multidisciplinary team. We're helping them note the group intensification strategies that are used with all of the learners in that intervention group. And then we're looking at the individual kids that really are the learners that are not responding as we would expect. They are really standing out relative to the progress of others in the group. So how would we individualize the intervention instruction? So we really think about 5 of those dimensions of intervention intensity. There's 2 that are missing from this list. When I looked at the dimensions of intervention intensity, to think about careful selection of interventions, like you're evaluating interventions, reviewing those to be able to select them to be in the school's intervention platform, we had strength in there, which was like evidence. We had individualization in there. When we're thinking about the adaptations to the instruction to make it more intense, you drop strength and evidence off because you're starting with the intervention that had been carefully selected. The learner was placed appropriately into that intervention. And so there isn't much we can do at this point about strength other than to be able to say, gosh, it wasn't a good match in the first place, and we've got to consider something different. But if you've really done your due diligence and you're looking at student data, you've got interventions on the intervention platform that include placement tests or a way to appropriately place the learner, you should have confidence that that is a good foundation to begin. The learners are being progress monitored. Okay, that's essential practice 3. And we're now not seeing the progress that we would have expected. So we consider behavior support. We consider the level of explicitness for the intervention. We consider attention to transfer, alignment, and dosage. So I'm going to give you some examples of what we mean. So let's play a scenario in our head. We've got tier 2, Mr. Howe is meeting with, has 6 to 7 kids in his or her, 5 to 7 kids in his or his intervention group. And Mr. Howe is looking at progress monitoring data by someone that is kind of an assessment expert on this multidisciplinary team. And they're noticing that there's one learner that is not responding. The progress monitoring data is just flat, even though our aim line continues to go up. So the gap continues to grow. And so for this individual learner, we now want to, with Mr. Howe and with others like the learner's parent and caregiver, the classroom teacher, and other adults that are meaningful to the learner, we want to come and sit down together, and we want to talk about look at the data and identify some hypotheses as to why the learner isn't responding. And based on that data, we may find that the learner isn't engaged in the intervention instruction. So some behavioral supports are needed. So there are some adaptations that could be made. So if this was our hypothesis, then we would design the individualized intensive intervention plan to list the specific adaptations that we're making for behavioral supports. So if I go backwards to this example, individualized intensive intervention plan, you notice on the right-hand side, the screenshot on the right-hand side, the very last row is behavior. It's behavior supports. So we would actually put what the adaptation is. We would type it right in because we want to make sure that that's documented. Of course, we would have other information filled out, but we would identify what that behavioral support adaptation is. So did we adjust the organizational and physical environment? Did we give students some strategies to help with their ability to persist? Because this is a situation, especially when I work with adolescents in upper L, middle school, high school, they have a low perceived probability of success. And so asking someone to do something that they don't think they can do immediately impacts their motivation. So as educators, we have to consider some strategies to help the student be able to persist. We have to acknowledge that, yeah, this is going to feel hard, but here's some strategies that we're going to use to help you, in addition to my instruction, to help you be able to persevere and feel like you want to even stay a part of the intervention instruction. An additional example could be teaching a learner how to incorporate ways to monitor their level of engagement. So some self-monitoring is incorporated, some strategies to reduce off-task behavior. Pages 22 to 23 of the intensifying guide does provide a list of actual examples. These are some comprehensiveness or the elements of explicit instruction adaptation examples. Reteaching yet to be mastered skills, breaking steps into smaller chunks, using, for example, visual aids or advanced organizers, additional guided practice. These are examples of how one could adapt the comprehensiveness, that dimension of intervention intensity. Here's some examples of what we mean by transfer, attention to transfer. The interventionist could help the students recognize the connections between what they're currently learning, so what they're currently being taught, and what was previously learned. There could also be the strategy to support students in using their strategies from intervention in the classroom setting. So, true story, as an interventionist, I've had students that have really truly thought that the only time they could use the intervention strategy is when they're in with the interventionist. It's like, oh golly, you could absolutely use it outside of the context of the 40 minutes in which we're working. So I work with teachers right now so I have the interventionist and the classroom teacher. They're working together, and the classroom teacher is seeking ways to incorporate, for example, the strategy for decoding multisyllable words into his or her classroom instruction, so that when a student comes to a word that the strategy should be used for, the teacher is going to prompt the use of that strategy because the teacher is aware of what it is. Not only is the teacher aware of what it is, the teacher knows what it's called and knows what the steps are to be able to prompt the learner to use it and actually be by the learner's side as they're using the strategy. That's an example of attention to transfer. It could go the other direction too, meaning it could go from classroom into intervention. One of the interventions that we've used in our middle school and some of the middle schools that we work with is there's an intervention curriculum resource that builds in after a certain number of lessons. The learners bring their core subject area text. So for example, like a social studies textbook, they bring it to the intervention instruction. And the interventionist is supporting students in using the strategy in the text that they're currently receiving for social studies instruction, or it could be the science text for science instruction. So that's an example of transfer going both ways. Classroom, interventionist has classroom teacher embedded in his or her instruction. Classroom teacher supplies text and additional resources that they're using with the student to be able to be used in the intervention instruction. So it goes in both directions. So some alignment adaptation examples. So there could be some, so the hypothesis could be the instruction's not aligned. And we're not ready to throw the intervention program out or the resource out yet. However, the hypothesis is it's not aligned. So some adaptations that we could make is we look at incorporating additional instructional strategies to address, some of those components of developing skilled readers and writers, some of those bars that are in the learning progression. So maybe some, like support for phonemic awareness needs to be incorporated. Some additional phonemic awareness support is embedded in the decoding and phonics lesson. Perhaps it requires a lower level program that does address some of those prerequisite skills. So maybe you are at the point where it's like, gosh, maybe we don't need to throw the entire program out that we're using, but we could incorporate some of the pieces in a lower level program and incorporate them into the intervention instruction. It can also go the other direction, and you could use a more advanced program, and you could say, we're going to just skip over the skills that the students already learned, and we're going to put them into lesson fill in the blank. So there are some ways to do that. Some additional examples. As students are applying their decoding and word recognition strategies, for example, to connected text, and if you have confidence, like you can see that the learner is able to read the text, but they're not understanding what the text, they don't understand the written text. You can add in an additional comprehension strategy, helping them make connections with what they're reading, helping them with the inference making or answering questions. So supplying some questions and having students be able to use the text to answer those questions. Now, notice I said that this is you're confident that the decoding and word recognition strategy is working. the text that the student is using, they're successfully reading, but you're starting to see that there may be some comprehension issues that aren't because of decoding and word recognition, because the learner's actually reading the text. So now you may have to now incorporate the comprehension strategies. We also have some strategies to support fluency building, things like repeated reading, varying the reading routine. So there's some choral reading together, peer reading, and you can even have students self-monitor their reading fluency. So these are some examples of adaptations. And last but not least is essential practice 5. This is the not so glamorous one, but I want to give a nod to it. So we're talking about the infrastructures or the systems to pull off the 4 other essential practices. You've got to have an infrastructure to support it. And so I'm a big believer that there should be a what we would refer to as a district implementation infrastructure. So we would want the executive leaders that oversee all the schools. They should have their own mechanisms for being able to help identify barriers that are getting in the way, remove those barriers, to be able to review and select and allocate resources for interventions. So a district infrastructure has to be in place. In addition to that district infrastructure, though, we would want to make sure that there's key decisions that our executive leaders are held accountable to making. Things like in addition to intervention platform review and selection decisions, assessment decisions. I've worked with districts that have had to deselect assessments. Like deselect running records, deselect doing a miscue analysis, because those things are, we should not be, we should not be supporting the 3 queuing system. And like it or not, a running record still is having teachers actually identify and do a miscue analysis, and it continues to perpetuate something that we know by evidence to not be effective. So we've got to think about deselection of certain things. We have to have an assessment schedule to make sure that learners are getting access to intervention in a timely way. And there's the provision to make sure that people are actually progress monitoring and that data is being used on a regular basis. So there has to be this overarching structure of support to make sure the things that should be happening are happening, and decisions are made by the right leaders to remove barriers and support people in doing what's needed. If we think about the school level contextual decisions, the role of the district, we say, is to standardize the process, while the role of the school is to contextualize the implementation. So decisions that are made by school leaders are things like our principals make decisions about when data are collected for screening assessments. They identify the staff who are responsible for being able to implement deliver the intervention instruction, grouping decisions, specific professional learning and coaching supports. And they do, in fact, school level leaders have to think about team composition. Do they have a school leadership team? Do they have a multidisciplinary team? And are those teaming structures using data to make decisions? So that was kind of the drive-by of the 5 essential practices for intensifying instruction. I would love it, though, if people, I know we have a couple of questions and I'm going to answer those, but if while I'm answering some questions, if you have a reflection or a takeaway, please feel free to add it in the chat.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. St. Martin. We do have a few questions in the chat, but you answered some of them already about the 3 queuing system.
Yeah.
It's very painful because, leveled literacy and balanced literacy have been a tradition in our province for decades. And unfortunately, our EQAO results show that there has been a decrease in children's ability to learn to read and to read independently without technology. So Thank you for addressing that. One big question was when you help districts. I mean, Dr. Gabb talked about this a bit in selection of screeners, is we do have to consider cultural, differences, economic differences. Can you guide us on how to select approaches or interventions while, of course, taking into account the socioeconomic, the cultural issues that might come up?
Or yeah. So Joanne, I will email you to add to the Padlet a link. So there is a document that I would strongly suggest that people look at. So our colleagues in the United States very much love the National Implementation Research Network, or NERN. They have something called the Hexagon tool. And it is there in what the Hexagon tool does there, and it infuses equity considerations, but the Hexagon tool it very strategically helps people make informed decisions about things like assessments, programs, in the context of 6 things, hence it's the Hexagon, 6 things: the need, the fit, the alignment, the resources. And the example that I will send you, Joanne, we in our state have taken the Hexagon tool and we've integrated the taxonomy of intervention intensity academic rating rubric. So we've taken that rubric that I shared, and then we give a nod to the other things that district leaders still have to attend to. And NERN has done a great job infusing equity and other considerations. And I would strongly suggest you guys look at that tool.
Right. Thank you so much. We do have another question about the running records. Okay, here's the question. This is very pertinent and important.
I know.
This lady, and I appreciate the question entirely. Can we confirm that it is suggested that we should not be doing running records at any grade, or is it suggested that it is largely in regards to early primary literacy practices? So people are also asking, how do you measure grade level reading if the only tool you've been using are the level literacy tools? That's the other thing.
Yeah. So I'm a big believer in curriculum-based measures like Acadians, FastBridge, AimsWeb, Dibbles, that have gone through quite a bit of rigor and analysis to appropriately take the passages and equate them to grade levels.
Wonderful.
I have students that do an oral reading fluency assessment, which is one of the progress monitoring measures. And they read for a minute, 3 passages, well, if it's progress monitoring, it's 1 passage for a minute. It doesn't mean that you still note the errors. Doesn't mean that I can't look at those errors and be able to see what they actually, like why it became an error. But the way that the miscue analysis is done in running records is that it promotes the 3 queuing system again. So my bigger issue is with the 3 queuing system. I'm a big proponent of listening to kids read. I do want to know how they're reading relative to the grade level in which they should be reading. And I want some evidence that the passages that they're reading from actually are an appropriate grade level passage, if that makes sense, Joanne.
Really, appropriate to the child's acquired reading, because there are foundational skills in reading, and at what stage are they, and is that assessment related to the stage or a little above, right?
Well, and in some, so for example, in Acadians, they have what's called a survey level assessment, where there is a very systematic way to test backwards and be able to look at what is the appropriate level for progress monitoring. But it is done in a very systematic way. There's an individual goal that is set, and that you can then, with Acadians, look at their pathway of progress and relative to all the other learners who had started at a similar spot. So yeah, it's very intentional and evidence.
All right. Well, we want to thank you so much for the clarity, the tools, the ethics of your presentation. Thank you so very much. It's amazing that your state offers the service that you provide. Amazing.
Oh, thank you. Well, and if you guys need anything, we share everything. So I am happy to give you guys anything that you feel is needed. Okay.
Thank you so much. All right.